Welcome to another edition of the Environmental Protection Agency's monthly feature, The Environment Matters, where we highlight the work of the agency in the context of national development and sensitize you on your roles and responsibilities as partners in this process. I'm Candace Thompson, Senior Environmental Officer at the Environmental Protection Agency. This month, our discussion will focus on biodiversity, conservation and management. And I have in the studio three outstanding guests who have immersed themselves for a number of years in the field of biodiversity management and conservation. Joining me for the discussion are Ms. Stacy Lord, Senior Environmental Officer at the Environmental Protection Agency, Dr. Priya Maharaj, who is a lecturer in the Department of Biology and also the director for the Center for the Study of Biological Diversity at the University of Guyana, and Ms. Juliana Prasad, who is the Biodiversity Officer at the World Wildlife Fund, or WWF as it's commonly known. Ladies, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
So Guyana is uniquely positioned. As we know, we have vast natural and biological wealth. Guyana is home to enormous expanse of primary tropical rainforests, freshwater and other ecosystems. And we form part of the Guyana Shield region, which forms part of the Amazon biome. The Amazon biome, as we know, spans 6.7 million kilometers square and is the single largest remaining tropical rainforest in the world, home to at least 10% of the world's known biodiversity. So ladies, to actually put this discussion into context, I think we need to define, some of the key terms for our viewers. Biodiversity, biome, ecosystem. What are we talking about when we speak about biodiversity? When we talk about ecosystem, we talk about biome.
Okay, quite simply put, biodiversity is a combination of two words, biological and diversity. Biological meaning life and diversity meaning the variety of things that we have out there. So biodiversity is the variety of life that exists in a particular area, meaning plants, animals, microorganisms. In this discussion, we'll also be speaking quite a lot about ecosystems. So that refers to the biodiversity, the plants and animals, and their interactions with the physical environment. So basically, quite fancy words for simple things, the variety of life out there and the way that they interact with the environment.
And the way in which we study biodiversity is at three levels. We study biodiversity at a genetic level, so the cells and the genetic material that they contain. We study it at a species level, where we look at the individuals, whether it's an individual plant or an individual animal. And as Stacy said, we study it at an ecosystem level, where we look at the interactions with these organisms and their physical environment.
Excellent. Just for clarity, do you want to provide probably some examples of what we talk about when we say biodiversity at the species level or a genetic, persons looking alike and stuff like that, or an ecosystem, just to give like probably one example or so for the various levels.
So, simply put, let us say we have a field, and in this field we have a bunch of different plants. So let's say we have a tomato plant, and we have a corn plant, and we have some sugar cane, and we have grass, and we have a few flowers. When we look at these different organisms, they're all plants, however, their genetic makeup varies. And this is why they look the way they look, because your genetics make affect the way your phenology looks, your phenotype. So each organism is unique. When we look at it at a species level, we look at the species that is corn, or the species that is sugarcane, or the species that may be the grass, or the different types of grass that we may have. And when we look at the ecosystem, we look at how all of these different species interact with the soil, how they interact with the other physical attributes of that environment and with the other biological attributes of that environment. So, how are the plants interacting with the microorganisms found in the soil? How are the plants interacting with the pollinators found in the soil? How are the plants interacting with the herbivores found in the soil? And what is that relationship between the herbivores, maybe the carnivore that will eat the herbivore, and the plant?
Hmm. Excellent. So biodiversity basically is a spice of life, as we said. It's what adds, variety. It adds value. Imagine if all the plants were the same, or all the colors, or the flowers, sorry, were of the same color, or everybody looked alike. That would not be as interesting. So biodiversity is really what adds. I don't know if you ladies would agree with me. What really adds interest to life. Having these different forms, and as you mentioned, interdependence and the interaction that is critical, and it brings me to my next question. So why would you say biodiversity is important?
I think, broadly speaking, if we want to, we've had a lot of complex discussions just now, but broadly speaking, biodiversity is nature. If we can think about that in its plain and simple terms. And so if we look out and we see nature, we see that nature is composed of so many things. All the plants, the food that we eat, the birds, fish, bees that pollinate. On our farms, we have cattle and all types of other plants and animals, agricultural biodiversity. So nature is really this complex, a complex system, and without nature, we cannot function. Our economies can't function. We won't be healthy people. We won't have food to eat, air to breathe, clean water to drink. So biodiversity can be seen, and nature can be seen as the foundation of our economies, the foundation of our health, the foundation of our freshwater systems. And so if we look at it like that, we really see the critical role that biodiversity plays in all of our lives.
Hmm. And even how dependent we are, as humans, on the services and so on that biodiversity provides. So we know that, globally we've been following the news, and even locally, that biodiversity is under threat. So what are some of the threats you would say to biodiversity, to us really, immersing ourselves and enjoying what nature has to offer us? What are some of the threats to biodiversity?
Well, one of the key things that we look at right now is loss of habitat loss for biodiversity as a result of deforestation or urbanization. Clearing where lands are cleared for, so that we could extend our pastures or agricultural lands for food production. Also for industrialization, where we're building new communities, moving into new communities. So when we clear these areas, we are in fact affecting what the nature and the biodiversity that lives there. Aside from that, we have issues with pollution. Climate change also plays a key role in terms of being a threat to biodiversity. We have things like invasive alien species. Those are species that are not necessarily native to a particular area, but then they come in and they compete for the resources that the regular biodiversity would be using in that area, and they can also threaten biodiversity. Generally, human activity can cause issues for biodiversity if we are not using it, or if we're not conducting our activities in a manner that is sustainable and conducive to that environment. So sometimes, things like these that could cause the loss that we speak of. And it's important that we recognize the rate at which we're losing biodiversity and the threat that these things pose to biodiversity. Because it is said that if we do not curb our activities and pull these threats back, then the biodiversity loss that we're currently experiencing would be irreversible in a few years to come, and that is something that we do not want to see happen. So, things like climate change, deforestation, habitat loss, pollution, we need to pay key and close attention to those threats.
And something that we have been paying more and more attention to, it's the overexploitation of biodiversity, and that happens in a number of ways. So wildlife trapping for different purposes, for food consumption, for the pet trade, that is still ongoing, and this has caused some species to actually move to the brink of extinction. And so hunting and trapping of species, it's really impacting their ability to survive and their ability to perform their roles in the environment and in the ecosystem. And so it's something that we here in Guyana have been paying a little more emphasis on. We know that certain species like the tawa, we have indications that perhaps jaguars are facing these similar threats. And so I think there needs to be more recognition of the issues and a lot more stronger work towards addressing threats to biodiversity.
And this brings us to the entire idea of monitoring biodiversity, because if you cannot truly assess what is happening with your resources unless you are monitoring, you have to know what is there and what are the trends in those populations. Are they increasing? Are they staying the same? Are they decreasing? And it's not just enough to know whether the population is going up or going down, because populations do go through natural cycles. What is important to note is why are they doing so? So they are dynamic, we do realize this, but we need to figure out, we need to have a systematic way of monitoring and assessing biodiversity so that we are able to establish why they are going through the changes they are going through. And if these changes are natural changes, or are these changes caused by another factor that can be detrimental to the entire ecosystem. Because as we have said before, and you have highlighted, biodiversity is interconnected. It is not just about one species. So if one species decline, okay, well, we may have lost a few butterflies. Okay, what's the big deal? They're all interconnected. That butterfly may be the pollinator for a specific plant. That specific plant may be the plant that's providing food for you.
Excellent. And I mean, you would have mentioned the interconnectivity, and even from primary school days when we did like food chains and food webs, and you recognize if something is removed or disrupted or depleted from that system, how it actually impacts on everything else. So you raised some key points there, Priya, and it brings me probably to my next question in terms of Guyana has been making some strides as it relates to biodiversity, conservation and management. I know more often than not, people take it for granted that, Guyana has a lot of everything, right? So we don't need to manage, we don't need to conserve. We could never run out of freshwater resource. We can never run out. We have a lot of forests. We can never run out of animals and stuff like that. But Guyana has signed on to these multilateral environmental agreements, some that's several and some that actually seeks to promote biodiversity conservation and management, because as you mentioned, monitoring is important, knowing what we have, what are causing the changes and stuff like that. So could you guys highlight some more in terms of what are some of the MEAs, the multilateral environmental agreements that Guyana is signatory to, and what does that entail? What does it mean when you sign on to an MEA, and how does that impact on biodiversity conservation management?
Okay, we have indeed signed on to quite a few multilateral environmental agreements, which means that when we become party to these agreements, we have certain obligations to uphold as a nation. And in upholding those international obligations, we're also ensuring that nationally we, prioritize what is important for us. So in terms of the multilateral environmental agreements that we have signed on to, I can speak to a few that the EPA especially are a focal point and for, and that the first and foremost we can talk about the Rio Conventions. Three of them: the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the United Nations Convention for Desertification. So the Convention on Biological Diversity specifically, the Environmental Protection Agency is focal point for that convention, and it's two protocols under that convention: the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and benefit sharing, and the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. All fancy words. Quite simply put, the Convention on Biological Diversity speaks to sustainable use of our biological resources, conservation of our biological resources, and fair and equitable sharing of the benefits derived from accessing those genetic resources. And that last objective of the convention is also what coined the Nagoya Protocol, which looks at setting up transparent legal systems for accessing genetic resources and sharing the benefits that are derived from those genetic resources. The Cartagena Protocol looks at ensuring that we have systems in place to be able to mitigate or to deal with any adverse effects that can possibly be as a result of the use of the products of biotechnology, modern biotechnology. And so in signing on to these conventions, we have we have certain agreements, certain conditions that we agree to uphold. And so we then have to take the necessary steps to ensure that we do our part to contribute to upholding those obligations, and then at the end of the day conserving and being able to sustainably use our resources. Those are three. We also have signed on to conventions like the CITES Convention and the Basel Convention. Just early in the week, I was at a meeting that indicated we have signed on to 26 multilateral environmental agreements, and we're probably quite likely looking to sign on to more. But by signing on to these conventions, what we are doing is indicating to the world that we are willing to do our part to take the steps that are necessary to preserve or conserve or properly manage what we have.
And not taking what we have for granted.
Correct.
As well, being more proactive in our approach to. Just for clarity though, when you talk about focal point, could you just clarify for the viewers what that means, and as well as you mentioned 3 Rio Convention. Why Rio? That's one. And the other 2, who are the focal points? So you're doing 2 things. You're clarifying what a focal point is or what that means, and why are they called Rio Convention. And the other 2 that you mentioned, who are or which agencies are the focal points?
All right. In terms of the Rio Conventions, Rio simply for the city in Brazil where the UN General Assembly was kept in 1992, where the three conventions were first opened for signature by to parties. And so we call them the Rio Conventions. In terms of a focal point, it simply means the agency that has responsibility for implementing those convention activities under those conventions, or for coordinating. Let me not say just implementing, because they will work with other stakeholder agencies that have parts to play. But they are responsible mainly for coordinating activities under those conventions and reporting to the convention on the activities that they would have implemented. Um, Again, for the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the Environmental Protection Agency is the focal point for that convention. For the UNFCCC, that convention, the focal point for that is the Office of Climate Change. And the UNCCD, the focal point for that convention is the Guyana Lands and Surveys Commission.
Excellent. So the CBD, or the Convention on Biodiversity, usually brings together what they call the Conference of Parties to assess the implementation and provide policy guidance, of course, to countries that have signed on to the various conventions. Firstly, who comprise COP? Is it all the country, the party that comes together? Is it everybody who's signatory, or is it a selected group that come to make these decisions? How does it work?
At the Conference of Parties, you have the parties that are signatory to the convention. You also have what we call observer parties. Those are countries or any institution or bodies that may not have necessarily signed on to the convention, but they have an interest to play. And so they are there, and they're a part of the discussion at the COP meetings, and so that at the end of the day, we have representation from all interested and relevant parties at these conventions.
Okay, excellent. All right, so the Secretariat, develop a strategic plan with objectives, strategic objectives as they're known, and what's known as the Aichi targets. I know in Guyana we have been, and ladies, you will agree with me because you're in the field for a number of years, a lot of work in terms of contributing towards the implementation of this strategic plan and so on. But Stacey, I think you could probably start off the discussion, given that EPA is the focal point for the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity. What are some of the things that are being done to implement the strategic plan as set up by the Secretariat?
All right, to go back and give some background on the strategic plan, every 10 years, there's a 10-year cycle for the strategic plan that the UNCBD would set up. So we are currently at the end of this 10-year cycle. The current strategic plan ran from 2011 to 2020. And so the strategic plan that the UNCBD sets up has 5 goals and 20 targets that we refer to as the Aichi biodiversity targets. Now, what parties did was looked at those 20 targets and saw and try to identify which one of these targets are relevant to us and we can act on, because at the end of the day, what we will be doing is contributing to a global right. So in Guyana, we selected, I believe, 13 targets that was relevant to Guyana. And we adapted those 13 targets to our national situation and created what we call the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. That strategy and action plan has 9 strategic objectives and quite a few priority actions that different stakeholders have responsibility for ensuring that they're implemented. And at the end of the day, the target is to ensure that we move from a certain level from one level to the next in terms of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and that will then add to the big picture of the Aichi biodiversity targets being achieved. And so from 2015, we had our NBSAP developed, and we have been implementing that NBSAP in in collaboration with quite a couple of other agencies like the GGMC and the GFC. And so getting those the different priority actions and the targets that we have set for ourselves as a country, trying to achieve those targets.
So the NBSAP, could we say it's more like a roadmap to Guyana's plan, where it's a 5-year plan for biodiversity conservation
Correct.
and management? All right, excellent. So I want to zoom in on a specific area though. We talk about the access to genetic resources and benefit sharing. And Priya mentioned research, and the critical role that plays in determining what we have and what systems we need to put in place to manage and so on. So what I know the UG CSBD has a major role to play in that regard. What do you say, or could you just clarify for the public in terms of what is really the role of the CSBD as it relates to biodiversity conservation and management?
So, first, I would like to go back just a little to Stacy's definition of a focal point. And the reason being is because, especially as it relates to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the EPA is indeed the focal point, but they work with many stakeholders, one of which is the Biodiversity Center. The reason that they're working with us as a stakeholder is because our mandate is threefold, and it falls directly in line with what EPA is doing and what the convention states. First, we are responsible for recording biodiversity. So ensuring that there is a record of what is there. Secondly, we are responsible for education as it relates to biodiversity. So it's not just important to have a little database or to have a little sheet to say, oh yes, in this area there is this plant and this animal and that animal. It is very important for us to educate the nation and to do so at various levels. And finally, it is part of our mandate to support the work of national agencies such as the EPA and to support conservation efforts. Many persons within the Biodiversity Center and within the university as a whole work with many of these partners when it comes to doing biodiversity research. I myself have worked with WWF in some of the work that they have done on biodiversity that looks at the wetlands area of the entire country. And not only are the staff involved in research as it relates to biodiversity and in supporting the efforts of these agencies and these conventions, our students are very much involved. Our students are involved from simply volunteering at these agencies, working as interns at these agencies, through the clubs that we have at the University of Guyana, and through the research that they do at an undergraduate level and that they do at a graduate level that support the study of biodiversity.
Excellent. So, I mean, UG, that's excellent because UG is the premier educational institution in Guyana, and we depend on the resources coming out of the university as well to inform our process. And as you rightly mentioned, there are a number of agencies who are doing their bit, NGOs and so on,
Yes.
that are doing significant work in terms of biodiversity conservation and management. So we want to speak some more in terms of getting the public to really understand the value of biodiversity, not taking for granted what we have. Why is it that we need to have these conservation and management systems in place? So we know Juliana mentioned earlier that there are several provisions that biodiversity make for us. So I just want for us to zoom in a bit to speak on a few of those so that people can, can really understand that they are an integral part of this process as well. And we talk about the interrelationship. We're all dependent on biodiversity. We form part of that network. So in terms of biodiversity, and let's say biodiversity and cultural development and culture, some persons may not directly see the connection, but if you guys could shed some light in that regard. Where do you see how does biodiversity connect with culture, for example?
Well, first off, when we talk about people realizing why biodiversity is important, I think one of the things that needs to be highlighted is that, and it needs to be emphasized, is biodiversity is not in the forest that's 8 hour drive away. Biodiversity is not in a plane ride away to Kaieteur. Yes, these are magnificent sites that have a host of biodiversity teeming. Biodiversity is also in your yard. It is in the hibiscus that you have. It is in the little honeysuckle that you have. It is in the sweet sage that you have. It is the pollinators that visit this sweet sage, whether it's a beautiful blue butterfly or it's a beautiful orange butterfly that comes there. All of this is biodiversity. And all of these are interconnected. So I think, first of all, that needs to be emphasized, that biodiversity is not far away. It is right next to us. It is everywhere we go.
We are biodiversity.
We are biodiversity, simply. And the reason that I wanted to emphasize that point is because I think we cherish, we look after, we conserve, we use sustainably the things that are close to us and the things that we understand the most. And this is why I wanted to make this point, that biodiversity really is all around us. As Stacy correctly said, we are biodiversity, and there is need for everyone. It's not just about the persons working within the agencies, it's not just about the scientists, it's about everyone playing a role in protecting and sustainably using our biodiversity.
Excellent. Anybody else want to add?
I guess in terms of culture as well, we have our indigenous communities spread across Guyana, and even to today, their lifestyles are reflective of one that's very closely connected to nature. So, from they still do traditional farming, traditional hunting activities, fishing, and so their daily lives are very intertwined with the functions of the forest, with the seasons, the rainy season and the dry season. So they live very closely. They understand, when are fires expected in the savannah, for instance, and how can they be able to deal with that. They understand cycles and when will the fish spawn, when are periods that they should not be harvesting certain resources. So some communities still have very close interactions with the natural environment and with biodiversity. But then again, it's not only communities in the forest, it's the coastal communities here as well. So all along the coast we have fishing communities, and some of these are like historical fishing communities where the economies of those communities depend on small-scale fisheries. And so, and if you look even at farming areas, it's very cultural, it's very built into people's routines, people's activities, what they do, how they know to live. And it would have been something that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were doing. So it's very embedded in the way that they function, the way that they work, the way that they interact with the environment.
And when we think of culture and we think of traditions that are passed on, something that's very common in Guyana, regardless of where you live, is something as simple as medicinal properties of plants. So we all knew what our great grandmother was using, and then our grandmother was using, and then it's passed to this generation, and then it's going to be passed to the next generation. All of that is culture. All of that, the passing of that knowledge, the passing of what are these plants, what are the compounds that these plants have, and how are they going to be used for our well-being. That is biodiversity. And this, all of that is culture as it relates to biodiversity. When we think of we're not feeling very well, we're not very happy, let's go take a walk. And we go take a walk in a green spacing in Georgetown. So we go to the botanical gardens. That is the interconnectivity with well-being, culture, and biodiversity. So there are many aspects of culture and well-being when you think of biodiversity.
So if you think about it, we are biodiversity, and as you said, biodiversity is not, in the jungle as it's often perceived. It's right out your window, or
Yes.
it's even on your table,
Yes.
right? As long as you're living and you're dwelling, we're dependent on biodiversity. So at this time we'll take a break, and when we return, we'll continue our discussion on biodiversity conservation and management in Guyana.